They laughed when she bought an abandoned cartel mansion for almost nothing. They said the house was cursed. They said no one who entered it left the same. But behind one sealed wall, she found a secret that would change not only her life, but the fate of everyone around her. Evelyn Harper's life had not collapsed in a single moment. It had eroded slowly, day after day, in the quiet way that ruins things beyond repair before one even realizes what has happened. Years earlier, she had lived in a crowded city where the streets never slept and the lights never truly dimmed. She had shared a modest apartment once filled with ordinary sounds of routine and presence. Then illness came, sudden and merciless, and took her husband in a matter of months. The loss stripped her world not only of a person, but of its structure. Grief hollowed out her days, and without noticing how far she had drifted, she began to fail at everything else. Work slipped from her grasp, first through missed deadlines and quiet warnings, then through termination letters that arrived folded and impersonal. Friends faded away gradually, uncomfortable with sorrow that had no timetable. Bills gathered like silent predators on the kitchen table. One apartment led to another, each smaller than the last, until stability became something she remembered rather than possessed. It was during this slow collapse that she accepted responsibility for 2 children placed into temporary care. She had not planned for it, and no grand reasoning guided her decision. It felt instead like a reflex, a grasp for something that still needed her. Jonah and Lily arrived with quiet eyes and thin belongings, carrying with them the weight of unstable homes and interrupted childhoods. Their presence did not heal her grief, but it gave it purpose. Still, the financial reality remained unmovable. 3 people living from temporary work to temporary shelter could not last. By the end of that winter, the last of her savings vanished into rent and utility fees, and eviction became inevitable. The idea of leaving the city did not arrive as hope. It arrived as surrender. Evelyn spent nights scanning listings for anything that did not collapse under its own price. What she found instead was an anomaly. A property far beyond what she should have been able to afford stood listed by the local municipal authority of a small coastal town in the south. The price was almost symbolic, barely more than the paperwork itself. The description was sparse and evasive. A large residence, previously seized by the state, sold as is. No warranties, no promises, no guarantees of safety. It took little effort to learn why the property was unwanted. Old investigation articles, half-forgotten criminal records, and archived court filings formed a fractured portrait of its history. The mansion had once been owned by a figure tied to a powerful regional cartel that had dominated smuggling routes decades earlier. His disappearance had never been fully explained. Some said he fled. Others believed he was buried beneath his own foundation. The house had been searched more than once, sealed and reopened, examined and abandoned. Nothing conclusive was ever found, yet nothing erased its reputation. The city wanted the building gone from its balance sheets. The people wanted it gone from memory. Evelyn understood the risk long before she signed the documents. She also understood that there were no alternatives left that did not lead backward into shelters and unstable foster redistribution for the children. The decision was not heroic. It was pragmatic in the way that desperation often pretends to be courage. The day she signed the final forms, the clerk avoided her eyes. The keys felt heavier than they should have. The drive south took nearly a day. The city unraveled behind her into long, open highways and expanses of quiet land. The children slept in restless shifts as the landscape flattened and widened. By late afternoon, the air itself began to change, carrying salt and stagnant warmth. The town appeared without ceremony, a scattering of low buildings, closed yards, and narrow roads pressed between marshland and the remnants of old industrial docks. Nothing about it suggested prosperity, but nothing suggested danger either. It was the kind of place the country forgot because it managed to forget itself first. The mansion stood apart from everything else. Hidden behind overgrowth and rusted fencing, it rose larger than reason among neglected vegetation. Time had left deep marks on its outer walls. Vines climbed the stone like veins. Shattered windows reflected the sun at strange angles. The gate resisted before yielding with a sound that echoed far too loudly across the empty drive. The children remained silent, watching through the glass as if the structure itself might move toward them. Inside, the house exhaled dust. The scale was disorienting. Massive stairways rose into dim upper levels. Faded elegance clung stubbornly to broken fixtures and ruined decor. Chandeliers hung dulled and incomplete. Floors reflected light only in fractured patches. The echo of their footsteps did not fade quickly. There was an impression of interruption everywhere, as if a life had been halted mid-breath and never allowed to resume. Even stripped of its furniture, the mansion carried a weight that had nothing to do with age alone. That first night they remained near the entrance, settling into one of the few rooms where the floor felt stable and the roof did not leak. Cold crept in through spaces that once were sealed. The plumbing groaned uncertainly. The children slept lightly, waking at unfamiliar sounds. Evelyn did not sleep at all. The house produced noises that could be explained but did not feel comfortable being explained. Wind pressed through hollow spaces. Pipes struck with metronomic irregularity. Somewhere deep within the structure, metal shifted against metal. She told herself it was only the movement of a body long neglected. Morning revealed what fear had softened. The house was enormous, damaged, and overwhelming, but not intentionally hostile. Damage followed patterns of abandonment rather than attack. The rooms existed not as stages for violence, but as victims of time. She began with the practical work, clearing debris, finding circuit panels, restoring water to a single sink. The children helped tentatively, relieved to be occupied. It was through their labor that the house began its slow reclassification from menace to challenge. The town noticed almost immediately. Curiosity spread faster than courtesy. In grocery aisles, Evelyn felt the shift in air when strangers recognized her. Some faces held open disbelief. Others carried unrestrained amusement. The mansion had been an object of shared superstition. Its new owner disrupted that superstition not through defiance, but through accident. Rumors surfaced in thinly veiled tones. They said she had made a bargain she could not escape. They said the house fed on people foolish enough to believe it was merely empty. At night, when the children slept closer together than before, Evelyn would survey the dim corridors beneath a single working lamp. The sensation of being watched settled not on her skin, but in her thoughts. She found herself pausing at doorways she had not yet opened. The rational part of her remained intact, but rationality weakened under the pressure of prolonged uncertainty. It was during these early days of renovation that she committed internally to staying. There was no ceremony to the decision. It happened quietly while she scrubbed mold from a wall no one would ever notice. Exhaustion drove clarity into her. Leaving would return her to the same slow erosion that had already begun in the city. The mansion might break her as well, but at least here she would be broken while building something. At night, the fear did not vanish. It changed. It became familiar, structured, predictable. The house tested her with noise and shadow. She answered with work. Room by room, she claimed space back from neglect. The children began to explore beyond the first floor. Their unease softened into cautious curiosity. Footprints in dust became their own. By the end of the first month, the mansion had not destroyed them. That alone changed its meaning. Neighbors still watched from a distance. Some hoped she would fail. Others waited for a story to be proven true. But the lights no longer stayed dark. From the road at night, the windows now held a faint glow. And somewhere behind walls not yet uncovered, the past remained sealed and patient. The lights that began to glow in the mansion windows did not go unnoticed. At night, when the town settled into its familiar hush, those faint rectangles of yellow stood out against the dark mass of the abandoned estate like quiet defiance. For years, the house had been a silhouette, a shape people passed without seeing directly, a presence best left unacknowledged. Now it had become something visible again, and that visibility unsettled many more than it inspired. Yet inside, the meaning of the light was far simpler. It meant warmth. It meant progress measured in small, stubborn victories over decay. Life inside the mansion began to repeat itself in patterns. Evelyn established routines where none had ever existed for her before. The children were guided through mornings of makeshift lessons at the scarred dining table. Afternoons were devoted to exploration and cleaning. Evenings brought exhaustion heavy enough to quiet their fears. The house resisted order at first, but not violently. It resisted through layers of dust, through broken boards that caught its skin, through rusted locks that refused to yield. Each small conquest changed the nature of their presence. They were no longer intruders. They became inhabitants. It was during one of these afternoons that Evelyn made the first significant discovery. She had begun clearing the second floor, drawn upward by equal parts necessity and unease. The upper level carried a different atmosphere from the lower rooms. The air felt older, less disturbed by the meaninglessness of recent years. As she pried open swollen doors and peeled back curtains stiff with neglect, the house revealed signs not only of abandonment but of interruption. Drawers remained half open. Shelves held objects arranged by habits that had never been formally dismantled. In one of the deepest bedrooms, she found stacked boxes that had escaped both state searches and the ruin of time. They were cardboard at first, then wood beneath them, all sealed with yellowed tape. Inside lay photographs compressed into brittle layers, letters tied with thread, small ornamental pieces dulled by years of exposure to stale air. The faces in the photographs startled her. They were not the expressions she had seen in archived crime reports or seizure inventories. They were not hardened by suspicion or shadowed by violence. They were simple, unguarded moments of human life. A hand on a shoulder, a child mid-laughter. A family posed in sunlight without awareness of the future that would erase them. Evelyn returned to these photographs again and again. She found herself studying the smallest details. The way eyes narrowed against bright skies, the posture of someone leaning slightly toward another for balance, the casual trust stored in proximity. These were not images meant for history, they were meant only for memory. And yet, memory had erased their owners while preserving the structure that once protected them. The children noticed the growing presence of these artifacts in the common rooms. The photographs appeared on shelves where books once stood. Letters were laid across tables not for interpretation, but for safekeeping. Evelyn had no intention of deciphering every script at first. The weight of the sheer volume was enough to demand respect. What troubled her most was not the humanization of the house, but the way it contradicted everything the town believed. It was easier to fear what could be summarized with brutality. It was far more disturbing to reconcile fear with ordinariness. As the weeks advanced, Evelyn began to notice structural inconsistencies. It started with instinct rather than observation. Certain corridors seemed shorter than they should have been when measured against the exterior walls. One narrow passage on the upper floor ended sooner than the logic of the building's layout suggested. Even after clearing the debris and dust, the geometry felt wrong. It lingered in her thoughts without demanding attention until one afternoon when she pressed her palm against the wall at the corridor's end and felt a subtle temperature difference beneath her skin. The surface bore no visible markings at first glance, but when she examined it under a lowered lamp, the texture betrayed irregularities. The plaster was newer there, not recent by any modern standard, but younger than the surrounding walls. The children watched as she leaned closer, her fingers dragging slowly across seams that had been disguised with patience but not perfection. The sound that followed when she tapped near one corner was unmistakable. It was not the dull resistance of solid stone. It was the hollow promise of hidden space. The decision to break into the wall did not come immediately. For days, Evelyn avoided the corridor entirely, circling around it in her movements as if giving that sealed section time to dissolve back into illusion. But the house had begun to speak in quieter ways since the photographs had emerged. It spoke through uneven drafts, through faint metallic sounds that vibrated just beneath hearing, through the sudden chill that would pass without explanation along certain sections of the floor. These were not threats, they were invitations. When she finally gathered the tools, the weight of the hammer felt heavier than its metal should have allowed. The first impact sent dust into the air in a choking bloom. The second exposed brittle brick beneath the plaster. She rebuilt her caution with every strike, fragmenting the past not with fear, but with restraint. Brick by brick, the wall surrendered. Behind it, darkness widened into form. The hidden space was compact and deliberately constructed. Not an accident of old architecture, but a cavity shaped with intention. Inside, set into the stone foundation itself, stood a heavy metal safe. Its surface bore no ornamentation, only age. The hinges were intact, the seams unbroken. Whatever it contained had not been disturbed by state seizures or curious trespassers. It had been sealed, waiting. That evening, the sense of occupation in the house deepened. The discovery cast new weight onto every sound. The children hovered near the doorway to the corridor, torn between fear and fascination. The safe dictated the momentum of the days that followed. Evelyn attempted to open it without success. Numbers worn smooth by time resisted interpretation. There were no visible markings left to guide a combination. The metal neither yielded nor accused. It simply endured. The frustration did not deter her. It redirected her focus back to the boxes of personal effects. If the owner of the safe had hidden it with care, then traces of intention would remain scattered elsewhere. Evelyn returned to the photographs with new eyes. She examined the reverse of each image. Many were blank. Some carried dates. Others held names written in unfashionable script. The repetition of a particular date emerged slowly rather than dramatically. It appeared on multiple photographs, always attached to moments of family gathering. It appeared again on the corner of a folded letter found inside a wooden drawer on the third day of searching. The significance of the date resisted immediate interpretation. It was not attached to any known crime listed in old reports. It carried no connection to prominent arrests or disappearances. Instead, it seemed anchored exclusively to private life. Evelyn hesitated to draw conclusions, but instinct whispered where certainty failed. The safe resisted until the fourth night after the discovery of the wall. The correct alignment of numbers was found not through calculation, but through persistence. When the internal mechanism shifted, the sound carried through the corridor with a softness that felt deliberate. The door opened without violence. Inside lay evidence, not of weapons or currency visible at first glance, but of paper bound by purpose. Documents wrapped in protective layers. A smaller iron case tucked beneath. Envelopes secured with degrading twine. Evelyn did not examine everything at once. The magnitude of the moment demanded restraint. She returned the safer contents to the common room table and spent the night watching the children sleep instead, aware for the first time that the past no longer hovered abstractly at a distance. It lay within reach of her hands. Morning brought the work of reading. Financial records emerged first. The language was dense and formal. Trust agreements buried beneath transaction histories, accounts referencing funds separated from visible streams of standard cartel operations. The scale of the numbers startled her more than she had expected. Yet it was not the money that altered her understanding. It was the language surrounding it. The purpose stated plainly within supplemental drafts, the creation of a privately funded social institution, a residential center designated for children displaced by violence, addiction, and economic collapse. The house itself listed as preliminary infrastructure. The papers carried urgency in their phrasing. Transfers were scheduled, revised, accelerated. Correspondence with third parties suggested a narrowing window of time, as though the author of the documents anticipated an interruption he could not prevent. The final entries trailed into uncertainty. The momentum of preparation was visible. The completion was absent. With this discovery, the mansion transformed again. It was no longer the stage of a crime myth alone. It became the skeleton of an abandoned attempt at restitution. The implication cut deeper than any ghost story. It suggested not simply a criminal history, but an unfinished moral one. Evelyn's instinct was not to claim the inheritance, but to validate it. She began with the archives of the county recorder, then the regional banking regulatory entries. Each appointment introduced hesitation, skepticism, and procedural resistance. She was advised repeatedly to abandon the inquiry. The system preferred its frozen histories unmelted, yet persistence carved thin openings through each barrier. Records confirmed fragments, account numbers without living representatives, legal structures awaiting custodianship. The moment the inquiries reached beyond municipal databases, attention followed. Unknown vehicles appeared intermittently near the gates. Individuals whose presence did not align with volunteer curiosity lingered without purpose. Correspondence arrived without return addresses. The tone varied. Some messages warned, others mocked, none asked. The mansion, which had begun to feel stable under her persistence, shifted in character again. The tension returned, not through sound and shadow, but through anticipation. The fear was no longer irrational, it was social. It came from memory that lived outside the house as much as within it. At the same time, the town's perception transformed under pressure of rumor and early reporting. Local journalists scavenged fragments of her efforts before facts could anchor them. Speculation grew faster than verification. Some framed Evelyn as an opportunist. Others suggested she had stumbled unknowingly into buried cartel wealth. The nuance vanished under simplicity. Yet legal confirmation arrived regardless. Authentication verified the documents not as fabrications, but as real constructs initialized by the former owner himself. The accounts existed. The trust structure remained dormant, not void. The pathway to action now lay open. By then, Evelyn understood fully that the house had never been merely abandoned. It had been paused. The corridors she had cleared no longer felt like remnants. They felt like withheld potential finally released into motion. The photographs that once unsettled her now instructed her. They told her not who the man had been in public, but who he had tried to become in private. And beyond the wall that once concealed the safe, the house felt different, not lighter, but quieter, not empty, but waiting. When night returned, the lights in the windows did not flicker uncertainly as before. They remained steady, and beyond the gates, the watchers learned that the house no longer belonged to silence. The house did not return to silence after the truth of the safe was revealed. Instead, it settled into a different kind of awareness, one that no longer felt blind. The corridors no longer echoed with the suspicion of abandonment, but with the quiet weight of consequence. What had been uncovered behind the wall was no longer only a relic of the past. It had become an active force pressing outward into the present, reshaping everything it touched. Evelyn understood this shift almost immediately. The documents she now possessed carried authority far beyond what their yellowed edges suggested. They spoke a language that governments obeyed and institutions respected. The existence of the dormant trust transformed the mansion from a local curiosity into a legal anomaly. Something that had been buried within sealed records and frozen accounts had returned, not as rumor, but as obligation. Her first formal request to the county offices was met with bureaucratic dismissal, thinly disguised as procedure. She was instructed to submit notarized copies, then certified transcripts, and then archival reference numbers that did not appear in any public index. What seemed at first like standard inefficiency gradually revealed itself as resistance. The structure had learned to live without the trust. It preferred that the trust remain dormant, inconvenient, forgotten. Yet Evelyn continued with a persistence built not from confidence, but from the certainty that if she stopped moving forward, the path would immediately close behind her. Verification steps multiplied. Third-party authentication was required. Bank instruments were traced through mergers, acquisitions, and frozen subsidiaries. The paper trail was old, but intact enough to reconstruct. Each week brought another request for corroboration. Each rejection arrived wrapped in language designed to exhaust rather than confront. Still, one document at a time, the case assembled itself. It was during this period that the pressure from outside began to formalize. The vehicles that had once appeared sporadically near the fence now returned with unsettling regularity. They never stayed long, but they did not need to. Their presence alone was message enough. The first anonymous note arrived folded into the metal gate, carried by a hand that made no sound. It bore no signature. The words were simple, cautionary, and unnecessary in their implication. Evelyn burned it without ceremony. More followed. The children noticed the change in her before they understood its cause. They sensed it in the way she locked doors twice at night, in how she watched windows rather than the horizon. The house felt larger again, but not with abandonment. It felt exposed. Local awareness escalated at precisely the wrong moment. A regional journalist picked up the story from the courthouse filings and published it without waiting for verification. The article spoke of hidden millions, of a mysterious benefactor, of a forgotten cartel fortune lying beneath the floors of the abandoned estate. The truth was buried beneath exaggeration, but the effect was immediate. Attention arrived in waves: curiosity, skepticism, ambition, resentment. The town that had once whispered now speculated openly. Evelyn was reduced to a symbol she had never claimed. Some saw her as a fool playing with dangerous history. Others framed her as a scavenger drawn to criminal wealth. A smaller number began to understand the weight of what she was attempting, and with that understanding came something unexpected: support. It arrived first in the quietest ways. A retired clerk from the recorder's office slipped her a missing reference code. A former accountant identified outdated banking language and offered direction without asking for recognition. A nonprofit advocate from a neighboring county reached out with structural guidance for establishing a legal framework around the trust's intended use. These gestures did not erase the danger, but they transformed it into something navigable. Threats became less subtle as validation progressed. A stone shattered one of the lower windows at night. Marks were scratched into the paint near the back entrance. Once, the gate was found unsecured after being sealed the evening before. Each incident was ambiguous enough to deny, but clear enough to instill uncertainty. The children were moved into the central part of the house at night. Lights remained on where darkness once gathered. Despite the escalation, progress advanced. Federal archival verification returned confirmation of the trust's legitimacy. The accounts existed precisely as described. The delays had not been born of procedural impossibility, but of institutional preference for erasure. Now that the existence of the structure was affirmed, the question shifted from whether the money was real to whether it would ever be released. Opposition intensified not only from the remnants of the cartel's influence, but from within the bureaucracy itself. Releasing funds tied to a criminal empire required acknowledgement that those funds had once been allowed to exist. It demanded a form of retroactive accountability. Few offices welcomed such a reckoning. Evelyn attended hearings that were never formally recorded. She submitted to background evaluations she did not ask for. Each step forward was followed by 3 meant to obscure her movement. Yet the foundation of her claim could not be undone without outright falsification. The documents were too precise, the signatures too verifiable, the intent too clearly outlined to be dismissed as coincidence. Public pressure transformed from spectacle to advocacy with equal unpredictability. Grassroots organizations began referencing the case as a test example of restitution. Students from regional universities analyzed it in legal forms. The narrative shifted slowly away from scandal toward responsibility. With that shift came visibility that made erasure more difficult. The threats did not stop. They adapted. A phone call arrived one night without a recorded number and ended without a word after several seconds of steady breathing. Another letter warned not of physical harm, but of ruin. It promised exposure, scrutiny, and the permanent marking of her children's future. This threat reached deeper than the others. Evelyn spent the night in the sitting room with all the lights on, reviewing every decision she had made since the city had first broken her. By morning, the fear of retreat had grown larger than the fear of continuation. The children became her anchor through the uncertainty without understanding its full scope. Their routines stabilized the days. Their small victories against distrust and instability justified the danger that followed her work. Every reminder of their fragile trust reinforced the necessity of the battle she had not sought. 3 months after authentication began, the first official correspondence arrived with legal weight. The Case Review Board recognized the trust as valid and unresolved. A partial release of funds was authorized under provisional supervision. The amount was small in context of the projected value, but immense in meaning. It represented the system's concession to the impossibility of permanent denial. Evelyn received the notice alone at the long dining table that still bore scars from the house's earlier neglect. The document trembled in her hands not from fear, but from the exhaustion of having carried the unknown for so long. The mansion felt closer to her in that moment than it ever had. The walls no longer watched passively. They bore witness. The partial release triggered a new phase of reaction. Those who had warned now recalculated. Those who had dismissed now reconsidered. The transformation of threat into pressure and pressure into impact unfolded exactly as history always predicts. Power resists redemption because redemption exposes the lie that power is permanent. Evelyn prepared for the next stage with deliberate caution. The money could not simply be spent. It required structure, oversight, and intention consistent with the trust's original purpose. She engaged nonprofit frameworks, child welfare consultants, regional architects. Every plan she drafted had to mirror what the former owner had envisioned without mimicking his methods. The vision remained. The foundation changed. The mansion, once broken into by neglect and secrecy, stood at the center of all projected designs. It would not be replaced. it would be repurposed. Its long corridors would no longer conceal. They would lead outward. Yet even as approval advanced, danger did not retreat. A final anonymous message arrived carved into the inside of the broken gate, where no casual hand could reach. It did not threaten her life. It did not threaten money. It named only consequence. It reminded her that endings are never unilateral, that past and future negotiate from unequal ground. She burned that message with the rest. When construction crews arrived weeks later to survey the foundation, the town recovered its breath in a collective pause. No one could pretend anymore that the mansion was a relic alone. It had become an active question forced upon the landscape, whether society was willing to let the dead speak differently. On the night before the first workers were scheduled to return, Evelyn stood with the children at the top of the stairs and looked down into the enormous hall below. The light spilled wide now. There were no corners left unseen. The house did not feel safer. It felt resolved. And beneath the surface of the walls that once concealed the truth, the future waited not as promise, but as labor. The first weeks after the provisional release of the funds unfolded with a careful slowness that felt almost ceremonial. The arrival of the engineers and inspectors did not resemble a sudden invasion, but a measured return of life to a structure that had long existed in suspended breath. They moved through the mansion with methodical patience, measuring foundations, testing beams, tracing hidden corridors of wiring and pipe. Their voices, low and technical, carried through rooms that had once known only wind and echo. Each mark they left behind on blueprints felt like a tentative promise that the house was no longer sealed in time. Evelyn followed them through every space, absorbing the transformation not yet in form, but in intent. The work did not undo the weight of history, but it shifted its gravity. What had once felt oppressive now pressed forward with purpose. The mansion did not resist their presence as it had resisted neglect. It yielded floor by floor, wall by wall, to the quiet assertion that it was being claimed for something other than secrecy. Funds were dispersed in narrow, carefully supervised channels. Supplies arrived in measured shipments. Old debris was lifted from rooms that had not seen daylight in decades. Broken windows were replaced with glass that reflected instead of absorbed. Electrical lines began to hum with steady reliability. The scent of dust slowly lost its dominance to that of fresh materials and open air. The house did not become new. It became evolving. As this physical restoration took shape, another kind unfolded beyond the mansion's walls. The town that had once shared a collective suspicion of the property now found itself bound, whether willingly or not, to its outcome. At first, the interest came cloaked in practicality. Contractors sought temporary work. Suppliers needed clients. A few residents arrived with cautious offers of assistance disguised as business. Yet beneath these transactions lived something more fragile. Curiosity softened into participation. Participation unfolded into investment. The mansion's fate began to feel tied to the town's own reflection. Volunteers arrived without announcement. Some brought tools. Some brought meals prepared in neighboring kitchens. Others simply came to see the interior for themselves, as though witnessing its transformation would confirm their own permission to believe in it. The gate that had once been an invisible boundary now opened as a threshold. The garden, long surrendered to wild growth, began to shift beneath new hands. Weeds were removed with patient restraint. Pathways re-emerged from beneath tangled roots. The fountain at the courtyard's center, discovered cracked and choked in silt, was unearthed and gradually restored to flow. Evelyn observed this movement with careful restraint. She remained the axis around which the work turned, but she did not shape it alone. Architects and social workers guided the internal design. Pediatric specialists advised on living conditions. Educators sketched the outlines of future classrooms. The trust documents did not dictate aesthetic or structure with precision, but their intention was unmistakable. The mansion had not been meant as a monument. It had been meant as a refuge. This distinction governed every decision. The wide corridors would not become sterile institutional passageways. They would carry open light and shared space. The larger rooms were not divided into anonymous dormitories, but reshaped into areas designed to cultivate belonging rather than supervision. Even the smallest architectural choices were filtered through the purpose of recovery, not control. When the first children arrived, the house did not greet them with ceremony. It received them with quiet openness. They came in uncertain steps, arriving from shelters, medical wards, unstable housing situations that had left their senses sharpened against disappointment. Some carried visible scars. Others carried silence heavier than words. They moved through the newly prepared rooms as if uncertain whether permission would be revoked at any moment. Evelyn learned then that restoration does not advance in straight lines. The presence of children did not bring instant joy to every corner. It brought fear before comfort. It brought defiance before trust. The house absorbed that turbulence the way it had once absorbed the ghost of secrecy. It became a container strong enough to hold what had been disordered elsewhere. Days filled with new rhythms. Lessons began at mismatched tables. Shared meals established the fragile structure of routine. The sound of running feet returned not as intrusion, but as affirmation. Laughter did not arrive immediately, but when it did, it felt earned. The mansion, which had once only echoed after footsteps, now produced its own independent current of life. The town's relationship to the house changed alongside it. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid the gate now paused outside it. Some simply watched from passing cars. Others came forward slowly, drawn by both suspicion and recognition. Donations began to arrive without ceremony. Clothes folded with care. Books marked with handwritten messages. Furniture assembled from pieces salvaged rather than purchased. Each gift carried the complicated acknowledgement of a past that no longer demanded denial. The remnants of opposition did not vanish all at once. They withdrew gradually, receding into irrelevance as the value of continued resistance diminished. The power of secrecy depends upon isolation. Once the house became visible with purpose, secrecy lost its leverage. Threats grew infrequent. Surveillance faded into absence. The remnants of the old order did not reconcile with the new one, but neither could they dismantle it without exposing themselves to the very scrutiny they feared. Years passed not in dramatic leaps, but in the steady accumulation of moments that only later reveal their weight. The children who had arrived trembling learned to sleep without waking from every sound. Those who had learned to withhold their voices found them again in unexpected places. Some discovered themselves in books, others in repair work, some in art that used the mansion's vast empty spaces as canvas. Each transformation was individual. None followed a single arc, yet together they reshaped the meaning of the house. Evelyn aged within this evolution, not as a guardian of memory, but as a participant in renewal. The burdens she carried from her earlier life did not vanish, but they no longer defined her posture toward the world. Loss remained present, but it no longer marked the boundary of possibility. The mansion did not become her replacement family. It became the environment in which new forms of family assembled themselves naturally. She remained at the center of it all, not through authority, but through continuity. Long after formal oversight committees shifted and personnel changed, she remained a familiar constant, moving through the same hallways that had once frightened her, now shaping them not with tools but with presence. When the trust expanded through supplemental grants and community partnerships, she treated growth with the same restraint that had marked the beginning. Not everything that can grow should grow without measure. The seasons transformed the estate in ways no ledger could capture. Spring returned the garden each year with quieter insistence. Summer pulled the children outward into open space and motion. Autumn marked time with falling leaves along walkways that had once been impassable. Winter reduced the grounds to silence again, but this time it was a silence of rest rather than abandonment. As the years accumulated, the mansion's identity shifted beyond the shadow of its former owner. The name of the cartel ceased to define it. The past did not disappear, but it receded into context rather than dominance. The house did not deny what it had been. It absorbed that truth into what it had become. Evelyn grew older without ceremony. Her movements slowed. Her hands lost strength, but she did not retreat from the rhythm she had spent a lifetime building. Even as others began to assume more of the administrative burden, she remained among the children, observing rather than directing, listening rather than commanding. She became a figure woven into the place rather than standing above it. The day came without announcement, forecast only by the quiet narrowing of her presence. It was not marked by spectacle. She was found where she had always been most at ease, surrounded by the ordinary evidence of the life she had cultivated. The house received her passing without disruption, as if understanding that death too belonged to its long education in impermanence. The town mourned without noise. There were no public ceremonies to elevate her beyond what she had been. The children gathered in the courtyard beneath the fountain that had once been dry and forgotten. Some wept openly. Others stood in reflective stillness. The grief was not theatrical. It was intimate. The mansion did not lose its pulse with her passing. The structures she had anchored did not collapse. The people she had shaped did not vanish. The work continued with altered hands and familiar purpose. The trust, now fully released, passed into collective stewardship, guided by the same restraint that had shaped its rebirth. In later years, visitors arriving without knowledge of the estate's origin struggled to believe that the walls had once concealed fear rather than shelter. The corridor that had hidden the safe became a simple passage. The garden where secrecy had once nested beneath wild growth now hosted gatherings that dissolved into evening light. The fountain traced its steady arc without whispering of the time it had been broken. The house did not forget what it had been. It no longer needed to remember it either. In quiet hours when the children slept and the routines of the day receded into background rhythm, the mansion returned to stillness. But it was not the hollow silence of abandonment that once ruled its halls. It was the stillness of use completed for the day, the peace of something fully inhabited. The light remained in the windows long after the town surrendered to darkness. And in that light lived the final answer to the question the house had carried for decades. Not whether the past could be redeemed, but whether the present would choose to try. And the present, shaped by countless patient hands, had already answered. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. We share new powerful stories every week, and if you think someone else would enjoy this, share this video with them. Thank you for watching.